We've been talking in this class with Professor Carrasco about how divination for the Aztecs was very much about the calendar. The Maya were also very interested in the movement of time and in connecting the calendars up to larger cycles of time. Astrological beliefs were attached to each of the days within the ritual calendar. In some ways, for the Maya, divination is really a question of numerology. They're looking for the relationships between the 365-day solar calendar and a 260-day divinatory calendar, and the number of days of agricultural cycles, political events, rituals, and various types of celestial movements. They're seeking the intersections that tie all of these different numerical groups of days together. In this way, the cosmos was connected to all of the events that were also taking place on the Earth plane.
So we talked about how early Christians deal with prophecy. They also engaged in various practices of divination in order to understand the future, in order to understand what they should do in the present. If we think about the world in antiquity, about philosophical writings and theological writings, if we think about some of the statuary and objects, like the coins that I showed you that have these images of fortune or fate, tiki, on them. If we think about these, we can almost imagine a word cloud emerging in antiquity. Moira, himarmeni, pronoia, providentia, fortuna. Words in Greek or Latin that kind of capture a concern about fate, chance, and success. Early Christians, among others, who had philosophical and theological interests, talked about these issues. Sometimes people talked about these issues in a really funny way, and I want to read you a passage from Lucian, who is a writer originally from Syria in the 2nd century, writing in Greek. It's from a text called Zeus Cross-Examined. In it, a human named Kiniskos questions Zeus, the highest god. And this is his question to Zeus. Well then, how about destiny and fortune? They're also very much talked of. Who are they, and what power has each of them? Equal power with the fates, or even somewhat more than they? I hear everyone saying that there's nothing more powerful than fortune and destiny. It's not permitted you to know everything, Kiniskos. Are you gods under their rule, under the fates' rule too? And must you be attached to their thread? If the fates rule everything and nobody can ever change anything that they have once decreed, why do we humans sacrifice to you gods? I really don't see what benefit we can derive from this precaution.
Now, I'll tell you two stories that show you this example of how important these mirrors are for divination and prediction. The first has to do with the great king Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl, Pilsen Quetzalcoatl, our young prince, the feathered serpent, is the great culture hero of Mexico. He has a miraculous birth. He has the ability to discover astronomy. He's the one who taught people how to grow tremendously abundant agriculture. He learned how to go into ecstatic trances through not only chanting but also bloodletting, and he became kind of the model for the priesthood. What happens is, in the Mesoamerican memory, he creates a great city, a great capital, golden era, called Tolan, and he's ruling there. But he has a rival, and this rival wants to bring him down, wants to put him in a different place. And in a sense, if you listen carefully, you can see the repetition of the story of the gods putting the breath on the mirror, breath on the eyes. What happens is this rival comes, and his name is Tezcatlipoca, whose name means the Lord of the Smoking Mirror. And he is the rival of the great Quetzalcoatl. And what he does is Quetzalcoatl thinks of himself as handsome and strong and is worshipped and so forth. But Tezcatlipoca comes and he has a mirror. And he brings this mirror into the palace and he thrusts it in the face of Quetzalcoatl. And when Quetzalcoatl looks into the mirror, he realizes that he's older, he's got wrinkles, he's got a skin disease, and he's finite in some way, just like humans are finite. And as a result of this, he falls into such a panic after he looked in the mirror that he realizes that a kind of cosmic prediction has been made against him. and he can no longer rule this kingdom. And so what he does, according to the tradition, is he takes some followers and he flees the city. The city falls into ruin. He eventually gets down to the coast, and according to which tradition you find, on one of them he gets on a raft of serpents and he floats away, promising to return one day. And the other, he sacrifices himself by allowing himself to be burned on a pyre. And it says that out of his ashes rose these birds that turned into the planet Venus and went into the sky, creating another great cosmic cycle for his followers to be able to divine the patterns of the heavens in terms of the Venus cycle.
The people who were invested in this type of divination were living in a city where a huge amount of resources were being spent on creation of bronze objects using extremely hot temperatures. There would have been a great deal of knowledge about the control of fire. They were also creating all sorts of tools and objects out of bone. What hopefully this has demonstrated is not kind of the trivial thing about that you can burn bone, but rather that this is kind of difficult. Right? And there's a lot of specialized knowledge involved in how this divination process and any other divination process worked. So this whole process of development from more than 5,000 years ago till 3,500 years ago, 1,500-year process of increasing complexity to the way in which this divination practice took place was the result of a series of experiments and attempts by diviners to use the knowledge they had about the medium that they were using to make the process more predictable in a way that they could then communicate with other diviners about what it is that they were interpreting. And then it sort of stopped archaeologically sometime between 1045 and 1049 BC. A group called the Zhou, together with some collaborators, overthrew the Shang. And they become at least nominally, the polity and power for the next 1,000 years almost. The transition from the Shang to the Zhou was one that was fraught by kind of military conflict and kind of transitions in power, but also changes in terms of the way that ritual practices took place. It's clearly not the case that the Zhou polity and the center of it was as invested as the Shang were in using divination as their main means of, using bone-based divination as their main means of communication with the ancestors and as a decision-making tool for political, social, and kind of economic maneuverings.
How do you live out in the countryside worrying about the annual inundation and whether it's going to smear the boundary between your fields and that guy's fields, compared to these larger issues of what God is and this larger pantheon of gods and local gods and who's watching over your harvests and a successful set of crops and things like that. And so who's thinking about the big picture items and who's not? And one way I think about this is in the later period, say the 7th century, 6th century, you get what's called an archaism, where people are going back and reviving earlier art styles, architectural forms, religious aspects, even grammar. They're using grammar constructions that have been dead for over 1,000 years and resuscitating them. So they must be in archival books somewhere. But this is all at the top of the societal pyramid, right? I mean, the guy's worrying about his fields out there who can't read is not worried about using that negatival construction in hieroglyphic text the way this priest is and reviving it, saying, we've got to latch on to the past, we've got to resuscitate what was great in this bygone
Is there
golden
any
era.
record of whether there was like a storytelling tradition where people, you know, went around and orally spoke about these things and discussed them?
Must have been, and whether there's a metric or thought couplets or songs or hymns as opposed to read text, I think there's certainly good likelihood of a lot of that. But you wonder about these classic tales that are repeated and reinscribed, and we have schoolboy texts and snippets and practice pieces, hundreds of them, and there are other stories that just survive in a single papyrus. So you're trying to judge how popular and widespread and ingrained into the culture they were. And this story I was telling about the one who flees after the assassination. This is called the story of Sinui, and it's the classic tale, and it survives in many, many copies and fragments and bits.
I love to think about, like, if somebody did this right now. I mean, first of all, they'd never be able to recover most of what's on the internet, so that's very sad. But let's say they did it 30 years ago, you know, and they have like little snippets of our culture, and they try to recreate what we think about religion and prediction and science.
Good luck to you.
Yeah, really.
I always say this to my students when we come back from touring archaeological sites in Greece and Turkey. You know, if one of the wonderful things about that trip for me is that when I come back to the States, I see everything in ruins, sort of in my imagination. Doesn't sound wonderful, but it means that, you know, if you think about a mall, you know, it's a litmus test for helping us to run the thought experiment of how are we, when we use archaeological materials today, understanding them wrong in antiquity. Yeah. And you think 2,000-3,000 years from now, people might go to a mall and say this was a site of worship. There are big staircases going up and down. There are massive, you know, attempts to create large open spaces, and they would be completely wrong, except insofar as, you know, maybe capitalism is the god of the modern period, right? But it's a that sort of fragmentary knowledge that that we have of antiquity is extremely frustrating. And
so the ruins of the Starbucks would be where the ceremonial vessels were kept in the temple.
And we know that the plastic and the styrofoam will last a very long time.